Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where in today's lesson we're going to be continuing our examination of Leviticus chapter 26, a chapter that deals with blessings and curses. We began looking at this in the last lesson, looking particularly at how the chapter is structured along the lines of ancient Near East covenant documents, particularly that section of the documents that deals with sanctions. Holding out the promises of blessing for covenant obedience, but also mentioning the penalties that would be sanctioned against covenant lawbreakers, those who break the covenant. And so the first part of the chapter deals with those blessings, and then that's followed by the curses for covenant disobedience. Again, structured very similarly to the sanctions component of an ancient Near East covenant treaty. We actually have a parallel chapter in the Bible to Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28. We see the exact same thing there. We see this lengthier, actually, than Leviticus chapter 26, a lengthier listing of the sanctions, beginning with the covenant blessings for obedience and the covenant curses for disobedience. And so this is a very similar chapter, but again, we began looking at it last time, and it does form a fitting conclusion to this section of the book that we're finishing actually right now. The last chapter in the instructions for holiness are Leviticus chapter 26, second to the last chapter in the entire book, actually, just one more chapter after this. But in Leviticus chapter 26, we have kind of this final statement holding out the encouragement for the people to walk in holiness. They've been receiving all of these instructions to walk in holiness since chapter 17, right after the annual Day of Atonement chapter, which is in Leviticus chapter 16. So from 17 to 26, or specifically, really, it's 17 to 25, you have all of these instructions for holiness. We talked about it being the holiness code. And now in chapter 26, everything is summed up by the Lord holding out this promise of blessing for a people, a nation who will walk in obedience according to his ways, but also at the same time holding out the reality of curses for disobedience for a nation and a people who will turn from these covenant stipulations in rebellion and sin. And so the curses are announced there in the chapter as well. But there's more than just that in the chapter. There's more than just the blessings and the curses. We looked at the outline briefly at the end of the last lesson, and we see there that we can break it down in these three ways. The chapter begins with the blessings for obedience, beginning in verse 3. We will come back to the first two verses because I think they're important, but the main structure of the chapter is beginning in verse 3 all the way to verse 13. You have blessings for obedience. And then beginning in verse 14 all the way through verse 39, you have the curses for disobedience. So there's a lengthier section on curses for disobedience than there is on blessings for obedience. And we actually see that mirrored in Deuteronomy chapter 28 as well. A really lengthy list of curses in Deuteronomy. In fact, it begins in verse 15 in that chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 28. And it goes all the way to verse 68. So instead of 14 to 39 that we have in Leviticus, we have a list of curses in Deuteronomy from verses 15 to 68. But again, similar in structure, beginning with the holding out the promise of blessing. And remember, Deuteronomy is written to a people who are about ready to enter the land. And so this is repeated, right? A second giving of the law. That's what Deuteronomy means, a second giving of the law now as the people are poised to enter into the promised land. So they have one last reminder that with obedience to the covenant, there will come blessing to them as a nation, and with disobedience, there will come curses. And so it begins that way in Leviticus as well, blessings and then curses. But we also have a third section beginning in verse 40 and bringing us to the end of the chapter in verse 45, and that's hope in repentance. So we see blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience, but there's also the hope that's held out, even to a people who had turned from the Lord and fallen into patterns of sin. There's the hope that's held out to them if the people will repent. We probably won't actually get into that in this lesson, but we do want to cover the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience, beginning with the blessings for obedience in verses 3 through 13. Now, I'm going to break this down into 5 categories of blessing, following some commentators who break it into 5 categories. Some see 4 categories of blessing here. Others see even less than that, 3 categories of blessing. I've adopted 5 categories along with some other commentators because it parallels what we see with the verses on the curses. I didn't mean to rhyme that. I'm not Dr. Seuss. But verses on the curses also have 5 categories. And so to parallel that, to mirror that, I think it's helpful to actually see 5 categories of blessing as well. And what we're going to see when we get to the curses is that everything that's held out as a promise for obedience and the blessing of the people is actually undone with the curses. Very, very kind of opposite thing will happen. Well, what are some of these blessings that are held out to the people for covenant obedience? Well, beginning in verse 4, and again, verse 3 is simply, if you will follow my ways, walk in my statutes, and do these things. That's just verse 3. So verse 4 and 5 speak of the blessing of rain, which will give the people an abundance of crops and provision. This is followed by the announcement of a blessing of peace, or the promise of the blessing of peace. Peace from beasts that would roam the land, but also peace from the sword that would go through the land. The Lord promises that if they will obey the stipulations of the covenant, that the Lord will bring them peace instead of beasts and the sword cutting through the land. So there's this holding out of shalom, right? That's the Hebrew word for peace. And so shalom is held out to a people who obey the stipulations of the covenant. We also read about the blessing of victory and success against their enemies in verses 7 and 8. We read about the blessing of prosperity in verses 9 and 10. This is prosperity really in material form, and that's something that we can sometimes skip over in the Old Testament, but the Lord does hold out more than just spiritual benefit and blessing to his people. He holds out very clear material prosperity for those who will walk according to his ways, in his wisdom, and in accordance with his statutes. And while obviously these blessings are held out to Israel as a distinct covenant people, I would argue that it's still true that those who adopt the patterns and the ways of God's wisdom will still experience not just a spiritual form of blessing, but also material prosperity. Now, one of the things we have to keep in mind here is that this material prosperity is promised even here in Leviticus chapter 26 to the nation. That no individual Israelite had a right to claim this as a promise personally, that if they walked in the ways of the Lord, that no calamity would befall them and that they'd enjoy all this material prosperity. That's not what's being set forth here. These blessings are general to the population, and it's not applied to any one specific individual, but the nation would experience stability, it would experience victory over enemies, it would experience rain. Again, that doesn't mean that no individual farmer would have a bad season of crops. It just means collectively as the nation. And the reason that's important to make that point is because some people will read these kinds of chapters and even affirm what I just affirmed, that God does hold out the promise of material blessings and prosperity for those who walk in his ways. Collectively, people will apply that individually, and that's when you end up with health and wealth gospel kinds of things. These teachings that if you just have enough faith, you can be protected from illness and sickness and calamity and the effects of the fall. That's thoroughly unbiblical teaching. But what we do see here in the Old Testament, and again, I think on some level it still holds true. In fact, I would even argue that the prosperity of the West, which has been so deeply influenced by Christian thought, by the Bible, by Christian morality, that prosperity that's been enjoyed over the last centuries is connected to acknowledging the God of the Bible and adopting his ways to a measure. Again, I think you have to be careful because Western countries are not the new covenant people. That's the church. And so, again, I think this is a mistake that's frequently made, that somehow the United States has become the covenant people of God. That's false. That's not true at all. But the United States has been deeply influenced by Christian thought, Christian morality, and there is blessing connected to that. And I would also make the argument that when we turn away from that leads to decline. And so the decline of the West is also connected to turning away from the wisdom of God's ways. And so there is a material prosperity that follows upon walking in the ways of God. Again, not for individuals to claim for themselves as a promise that God has given to them, that I'm going to prosper materially if I'm obedient. That's not what's being conveyed here. But there does seem to be a connection between adopting God's wisdom and eventually enjoying a general kind of prosperity. So this is held out very clearly here to Israel, nevertheless. But that's not the greatest blessing. Even the material blessings are pointing to something else, and that's the blessing of presence. The key verses here, probably in the entire chapter, are verses 11, 12, and 13. It's the greatest blessing. Now remember, as I say all the time, we don't take the time to read through the verses and the chapters here in our time together. And so if you haven't taken time to read Leviticus chapter 26, you can pause it right now, read it, and then come back and pick this back up. And you can kind of see again how the chapter is going to break down this way in the verses in these ways. But verses 11, 12, and 13 are key because the material blessings are a reflection of something deeper, and that is, if I can get my face out of the way, that is fellowship with God. Fellowship with God is the consummate blessing that's held out to the covenant people. The greatest blessing is not rain or peace or victory or material prosperity. What God offers to his covenant people ultimately, and this is true in the Old Testament, it's true in the New Testament, is what he offers is himself as the greatest blessing. As St. Augustine writes, he will be the consummation of all our desiring, the object of our unending visions, of our unlessening love, and of our unwearying praise. He is the consummation of all of that desiring. He is the object of our love and our desire, and he is the ultimate blessing. Now, L. Michael Morales, who's written this book called Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord, I've talked about that book before, and he really highlights the importance of Leviticus chapter 26, verse 12, when he writes this. Leviticus 26:12 brings a new development, closing with a promise that goes, I'm going to get myself out of the way again, that goes beyond the mediation of the sacrificial cult. In other words, it goes beyond what we're reading about here in the entire book of Leviticus that happens through the Levitical priesthood. Leviticus 26:12 is bringing a new development, going beyond what can be enjoyed through the sacrificial cult to an even more direct form of engagement between God and humanity. More direct form of engagement. Remember that even though God has established his tabernacle in the midst of his people, he's dwelling with his people, there's a sense in which that place where God is dwelling in the most holy place, between the cherubim where the blood is shed or applied on the Day of Atonement, only one person is entering into that area, into that kind of presence of God. God is dwelling in the midst of his people. But remember, all the other Israelites, besides the priests, are just in the courtyard of the tabernacle. It's only the priests who can go into the holy place where the table of showbread is, where the lampstand is, and where the altar of incense is. But even there's a deeper chamber called the most holy place, where the Ark of the Covenant is, the mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and only one person has access to that, and that person only one time a year on the Day of Atonement, and that's the high priest. And so what Morales is talking about here is 26:12 is seeming to suggest something deeper than that. But this is what he goes on to say. This prospect becomes possible because the holiness previously reserved for God, his sanctuary, and the priests in Leviticus 1 through 16, and that was the concentration there. It was the holiness of God and of his sanctuary and of the priests. But now that holiness is being vouchsafed to the community of Israel as a whole in the second half of Leviticus. Remember that the people, the nation as a whole, are learning the distinction between clean and unclean in chapters 11 through 15. They have been entirely purified on the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. And now there's this prospect of Israel's full consecration to God in chapters 17 through 25, the holiness code. And if they will keep this holiness code, if they will pursue holiness, it yields the promise of Yahweh's permanent presence outside the sanctuary, which is returning humanity to the golden age before the flood. So some insightful comments there, but to expand a little bit on his comments about returning humanity to the golden age before the flood, he says this, the page before in his book, what we just quoted on the previous slide. The next slide is quoting from page 217, where Morales writes, as the culmination of the list of blessings, Yahweh promises not only to set his tabernacle in the midst of Israel, which is the hope of Exodus 25 through 40. And again, the worship of that tabernacle comes to full expression. Tabernacle worship comes to full expression in Leviticus 9, remembers, where the glory of the Lord appears to the people. So you can go back and look at Leviticus chapter 9, and the significance of that we talked about in this series. But it's more than that. He will not only set his tabernacle in the midst of Israel, but that he will even walk in their midst. A statement that another author named Nehon posits that clearly goes beyond the previous one. He also notes that the terminology of 26:12 is actually reminiscent of descriptions found in the primordial period before the deluge or before the flood in Genesis 1 through 5. Remember, the flood narrative begins in Genesis chapter 6. There's this preface as to why the flood happens, and then we're introduced to Noah in Genesis 6. But in Genesis 1 through 5, we see that the distance between God and humanity was clearly less marked, and where certain privileged ancestors are said to have walked with Yahweh. We read about God walking in the garden in the cool of the day in Genesis chapter 3, right before he confronts Adam and Eve with their rebellion. We also read of Enoch, who walked with God as part of the genealogy extending from Adam. So on this interpretation, the ultimate blessing of Leviticus 26 considers nothing less than the restoration in Israel. Okay, it's not global at this point. It's the restoration in Israel of the relationship between God and man that existed before the flood. And remember, Israel is specifically adopted for this because they're the ones that are receiving this holiness code by divine revelation. This is not yet being given to all of the nations. It's just being given to Israel. And so this is connecting the conclusion of Leviticus, or the near conclusion. Remember, there's one chapter after Leviticus 26. But the conclusion of Leviticus is being connected to the beginning of Genesis. So I think those are some helpful and insightful comments that Morales makes about understanding the blessings that are conveyed here. That there's a number of them, right? But it culminates with this promise that God holds out that they will dwell in his presence, that he will dwell in their midst, he will walk with them. And that just reminds us, as well as we read the book of Leviticus, that the ultimate blessing that God holds out to us are not things. They're not material blessings. They're not some kind of prosperity. It's not protection from illness or anything of those things. Although God might do those things in his grace, the ultimate blessing that he holds out to us is himself. And to have God is to have life, and to have life everlasting. Well, so much for the blessings. For obedience, in verses 14 through 39, we read about the curses for disobedience. So very quickly, let's walk through these. Actually, let's just introduce these. I probably won't have a time to actually unpack them, but let's say some introductory remarks about the curses for disobedience. These verses describe what happens when God's blessings are withheld or forfeited. And forfeited is probably a better word because it's not that God just arbitrarily withholds them. The people forfeit the blessings and enter into the curses or receive the curses because of their own disobedience. And specifically, that disobedience is reflected by not listening. The first step toward disaster was a refusal to listen. We see this in verses 14, 18, 21, and 27, this repeated phrase, and if you will not listen, the ESV renders it specifically this way, but if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments. And again, that kind of idea of not listening is repeated again and again and again. It's a first step toward disaster and for forfeiting God's blessings. And it reminds us also that that's a first step toward us being outside of the sphere of blessing that God would offer to us, is not listening. And to be his people, to be his covenant people, is characterized by being a people that heed his word, that heed the scriptures, that study the scriptures and obey the scriptures. The prophets often reminded the people of the reality of these curses for breaking the covenant in an attempt to halt the slide into exile. And so the only reason, what I'm pointing out here is it's a really good thing to know Leviticus chapter 26 particularly, and Deuteronomy chapter 28 particularly, because when we get into the announcement of the writing prophets in the scripture, when they're going to the people, they're calling the people back from their wayward ways by reminding them of the covenant curses that will accompany continued obstinance and rebellion. Again, God is very long-suffering in the Old Testament. He sends prophets to reclaim the people, but what the prophets are declaring is these covenant curses will come to pass because of your disobedience. God will show himself faithful to his word, not only to bless, but to unleash curses. And of course, they don't heed the word of the prophet either, right? If you will not listen, these things will happen. And God sends prophets and they don't listen. And so subsequently, these verses actually read like a history of Israel. who is eventually exiled for refusing to listen. They reject the Lord and they break the covenant, and so they are exiled. And so that's actually one of the last curses that we're going to read about. We're not actually going to have time to get into all the curses in this lesson. But the final curse announced is the contrast to the final blessing, right? To be blessed in the fullness is to be in the presence of God, who is life, and to bask in that presence and receive that life in him. But to be exiled is to be removed from that presence. And to be removed from the presence is to be dead. And again, I think we've talked about this before, that life and death have more of a qualitative sense scripturally than we often assign to them. We just often equate life with being physically alive and death with being physically dead. But scripturally, it's more than that, right? I mean, the scriptures talk about being dead even while you're living. We've talked about this in this series before, right? It's where the concept of, or the idea of zombies is actually quite biblical, right? The walking dead. Paul talks about this in Ephesians chapter 2, while you were dead in your trespasses and sins. But he's talking to people who are alive. But qualitatively, they were dead. And to be exiled from the presence of God, to not be in fellowship with the living God, is qualitatively to be dead, while to be in his presence, in fellowship and communion with him, is to be alive. And so, I just wanted to point out those parallels. To the last blessing is the presence of God, and the last curse is to be exiled from the presence of God, which is to be in death. So this is a good time to stop. We're going to talk about 5 categories of curses as well that kind of mirror or parallel the 5 categories of blessing that we've looked at in this lesson. We will eventually get, hopefully, Lord willing, to the hope in repentance that's held out in this chapter as well. So we might be able to finish the chapter in the next lesson, but we'll certainly begin with the 5 categories of curses. And so you'll want to hear them. So hopefully you'll join us again for the next lesson. And in the meantime, God bless.